Hi, welcome to an interaction today with Cary Bazalgette. Cary worked at the British Film Institute from 1979 to 2007 after teaching English and filmmaking in London secondary schools. And her book, How Toddlers Learn the Secret Language of Movies, was published in 2022. In this book, she talks about something called embodied cognition. And of this book, media literacy scholar David Buckingham said, Cary's approach takes us beyond narrow concerns about risks and benefits to look at the cultural dimensions of children's engagement with film and television. So it's a very important book, I think, for media literacy. As head of BFI education from 1999 through 2006, Cary led the development of new approaches to education about moving image media for the 3 to 14 age group. She's written and edited several classroom resources for media education and has published and spoken on this topic across the UK and around the world. In 2018, she completed a PhD on 2-year-olds' encounters with these media. So do we recognize all the dimensions of media literacy? Have we successfully included these dimensions? Is there something more to the cognition of media literacy, for example? There are several questions that are unanswered in media literacy, and Cary is here to help us with some of them. So this is where I toss it over to you, Cary, to help us understand, is there more to the very definition of media literacy as we know it?
I find it a little bit hard to answer that because really I have a problem with the term media literacy in the first place. I think it's increasingly the word literacy, it's become degraded and impoverished, I think, in the last certainly in the last 20, 30 years. One could argue that it became degraded once the universal education came in at the end of the 19th century, and literacy was defined against illiteracy and seen as to do with, social, the problems of the working class and the fact that they couldn't read the notices in their factories. And so it became extremely narrow then from what was originally in the 16th and 17th century, a description, a literate person was somebody who was well read. They knew a lot. It's about a breadth of knowledge and understanding. And you call me reactionary if you like, but I'm really keen to hold on to that because I think that's the basis of a genuine educational project. And I think the problem with media literacy, I checked this online, I could find about 40 different kinds of literacies. And to my mind, they're all, they're just kind of catchphrases. They're just kind of airy nothings saying, oh, well, this is really important and people ought to know about it and there's the right things you ought to understand and be able to deal with in whatever field this is, whether it's, let me look at some of them. Digital health literacy, right, okay. Financial literacy, food literacy, geoliteracy, health literacy, it goes on and on and on. In other words, by calling something media literacy, you're attaching it to a trivialization agenda, I think. And it becomes then quite easy, as has happened in the UK with Ofcom's definition of media literacy, which they say is going to be like the Green Cross Code, in other words, a highway code for children to be safe. And that's all it is.
And Ofcom's, of course, is the communications regulator in the UK.
Yes. And the NATO report that Tessa Joles recently publicised, where I can't find the quote now. Citizens are truly the first line of defence. They have to deploy a societal capacity. I don't quite know what that is, but anyway, for strategically utilising media literacy as a way to combat the propaganda. It's a get-out clause for organisations. Say, yeah, well, we're doing media literacy, so that's fine. I think it cheapens what should be a really profound and very broad educational project and is better called something else. I mean, I've never been happy using the term. I've always used the term media education, because that's the process. That's what we need to pay attention to. We hope some people become more literate at the end of it, but basically our business is establishing that in schools. That's my agenda.
Right. So if we can unpack that a little bit more in terms of education versus literacy, and I see where the problem lies. Apparently, education is more about making someone knowledgeable, whereas literacy is a tool. I mean, typically or historically, that seems to have been the kind of definition that we have about literacy per se. I mean, Brian Street, for example, it recognizes social literacy, I mean, different kinds of literacies, some of which are newfangled, the ones that you read out. But would you then like to differentiate between media education as we know it at, say, media colleges or media departments, and the kind of education that somebody who's not from the media should have? For example, I'm not an engineer. But if somebody were to say you need engineering literacy, what would I need? So, is it something like that?
No, I mean, when I'm talking about literacy, I'm not talking about media education, rather. I'm not talking about that as professional training for the media, by no means. I mean, I think there's, underpinning this, we won't have time to go into all this, but I think it's a huge kind of gulf between North American ideas about media literacy and those in UK and in Europe. I think they're really very different in significant ways. Literacy is the outcome you hope for with media education, although I'd rather not call it that for the reasons I've already described. But it's something that we, struggled for ages, and that at one point succeeded in getting it into the compulsory national curriculum, that children should be looking at all kinds of media. I mean, this was before the time of social media, so, it's a different kind of environment, but television, film, newspapers, press, magazines, radio, all of the ways in which people sort of communicate, and the ways in which people share their stories and understand it's part of their culture. This is the important thing, that media deliver cultural forms. That's the thing they do. So media education as an entitlement for all children has always been the thing that I've thought needs to be there. My book is rather a different thing, because I'm underpinning that by saying, actually, media, I wouldn't call it media education really, but anyway, children's engagements with moving image media.
But you did make it clear, though, that when you talk about education process, and literacy is the status that you achieve after that. So we got that. Yeah. So you can use it if you like. Yeah.
Well, you have different levels of literacy. You might be a bit literacy, and you might be literate, and you might be very literate.
Right.
My book is about pointing out that children engage in a self-directed learning in order to make sense of this fantastic stuff that's coming through, their phones or their iPads or their TV sets. And it's just amazing to watch that in 2-year-olds, which is that kind of study, as far as I know, has never been done before.
I want to probe that a little bit, because you take a cognitive kind of an approach as well. And there's something that you're calling embodied cognition.
Yeah.
And this is fascinating, because then it expands not only the idea that media literacy or media education starts way before we think it starts.
Yes.
And then we can only add on to it, and therefore the responsibility lies also at home. So would you unpack this embodied cognition for us?
Yeah, you see, I'm not saying let's stuff embodied cognition into media literacy too, make life even more complicated. What I'm saying is, for me, embodied cognition was part of a methodology. It was a way of, when I first, I collected something like, 12, 15 hours of kids watching TV. And then I started to do my analysis, and it was kids watching TV. And I thought, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know how to. And then what I realized was I needed to be looking far, far closer at the tiny signs. These were children who were pre-verbal for at least half the time. of how kids are paying attention, needing to see something again and again, betraying with tiny things with their eyes, their faces, and their hands, which are harder to read in a 2-year-old than they are in, say, yours, for example. Adults are much more explicit with their facial expressions. So that it was just part of my methodology for the analysis. I'm not saying, I mean, there is very interesting work in the neuroscience underpinning embodied cognition about how instinctive behavior works, about how we imitate one another through our mirror neurons, probably still debate about that, and about how a much broader definition of what emotion is. So, an important emotion that I was looking at was the emotion of seeking. And
right.
When a kid needs to find something out, really interested, and we all have that feeling all the time, and that drives emotions drive action.
It is fascinating how that might actually collide a little bit with what we are calling critical thinking in media literacy, right?
I think that comes much later, and critical thinking is quite a sophisticated thing. You're going to have to be about at least 9.
Yes. Well, I know there's going to be an age difference. I was just thinking, then, is critical thinking a correction of that kind of emotional response?
No, because you're always going to have an emotional response. If you don't have an emotional response to the next opera you watch, or TV series that you watch, what's the matter with you? That's how we engage with culture. There's a sort of feeling that appealing to the emotions is a bad thing. No, it isn't. Our emotions are what drive our thought. It's a Cartesian notion that the emotions are separate somehow from us as rational beings. That's not the case. They're bound in with them.
Do you also believe that media literacy, whatever we want to call it now, is essentially cultural in the sense of it needs to be contextualized culturally? Well,
media are cultural. Okay, media provide us with cultural forms. A medium is the technology and the process and the industrial establishment that enables the TV series to reach you. So what's appropriate for education about the media is something that takes account of it as a cultural form, which I think too often it doesn't. I mean, there's this constant reference to media messages, which really annoys me. They're not just messages. Shakespeare doesn't produce messages. It's more complicated than that, and it's richer and more exciting than that. And I feel there's a sort of dead hand of, here's some bad stuff going on and we're going to stop you doing it. I find that rather sad. Well, unfortunately, this fascinating conversation has to end at this point, but I'm sure that folks would love to read your book and also hear more from you about your thoughts. Thank you so much, Cary, for joining us today.